In this lesson, we are now going to be learning about cloth dynamics and the 7 clothing fold types. Now, we're not really dealing with clothing design, but really the dynamics of how cloth works and moves. This, of course, does vary a little bit based on the material that you're using, but generally speaking, you can apply this to most types of cloth used for clothing. All right, so let's get right into it and talk about cloth dynamics. So cloth really is very similar to hair in that it really is impacted a lot by gravity, and as such we need to consider the direction of gravity affecting the cloth, right? So we want to consider the direction of gravity. And in this as well, we want to think very much about swash and stretch on the fabric itself, right? We're just going to talk about these concepts a bit, and you'll see the application of these as we go through each of the 7 types of folds. Another important point that I want you guys to take down, and it's very, very valuable, it's very simple, but very valuable, is that generally speaking, when cloth bends, it never has a sharp point, generally speaking. It generally always bends at a round angle. So when you're doing clothing folds, you generally don't have very sharp bends like this. You'd have more of a rounder bend, and that will make your clothing folds look more realistic and less flat. And then the last thing we want to do when we're thinking about cloth dynamics is ask ourselves, where is the point of tension, right? Where is the point of tension? And the point of tension here is really relating back to squash and stretch in the direction of gravity as well, in terms of where is the cloth pulling based on the form that you're putting the cloth on, right? So where is the point of tension? Lastly, let me add something obvious, but I want to say it just so that we're really firm in what we're doing. That cloth really is nothing more than, of course, almost a very kind of 1D object in a sense. Obviously it's 3D, but for the most part cloth really is just very thin, and we don't tend to double line draw it unless we're talking about thick fabrics. And so in light of that, clothing takes its form really from the underlying forms. So if we wrapped cloth around a cylinder, the cloth is going to take the shape of the cylinder, more or less, of course, based on the fabric type and what have you. And so I'm reinforcing this so that we realize the clothing has to naturally follow the contour lines, right? Follow the contour lines of the underlying anatomy. Okay, so we want to keep that in mind. If we don't follow the contour lines of the underlying anatomy, the clothing then looks very flat or like a sticker, or it really detracts from the 3-dimensionality of our piece. All right, and we really don't want to do that. We want it to look 3D all the time. And so now we're going to move into applying some of this theory. I'll put these notes to the side so that they're always with us. We're going to apply some of these theories by looking at the 7 types of folds. And let me list them out before we draw them, just so that if you are taking notes, you can write them down as well. And then we will go into them. So I'm going to put them here, 7 folds. And really, a dynamic look in clothing and a realistic clothing look is more about how the clothing is falling on the body and folding, right? And wrapping around the forms than it is really about the design of the clothing in terms of drawing it in a believable way. All right, so our first type are pipe folds. Our second type are zigzag folds. Our third type are spiral folds. Our fourth type are half lock folds. Our fifth type are the unfortunately named diaper folds. Our sixth type are drop folds. And our last type are inert folds, right? Inert meaning inactive or not really moving. Okay, so inert folds. Right, so let's get into it, and we're going to start drawing out our folds. We're going to start with pipe folds. So pipe folds really occur when the fabric is being draped, usually usually at quite a length. So a good example is thinking about curtains. And when the fabric is draped, thinking about that gravity direction, fabric is draped, and let's keep it simple for now. We won't put any pipe folds in here, right? Assuming this is a curtain type of draping, right? These are the points of tension here, and I will continuously draw in points of tension as we're doing this, so we get a good idea. Gravity will pull down, and what will happen is the fabric will start, based on the points of tension, it will start coming down into these pipe shapes, right? And taking on a very cylindrical form as this is occurring. And it will rhythmically move in and out. Obviously in art we will want to vary what is occurring there a little bit. In terms of the rhythm, we wouldn't want them to be all exactly the same. And so here we get our pipe folds that follow the contour really of a cylinder, in and out and in and out and in and out consecutively. And oh, I see this one goes in twice. Not impossible. And out and in and out. And this is essentially a pipe fold. And it's named like that obviously because it is somewhat like a pipe. So long dresses, for example, will take on the look of a pipe fold. Let's bring a dress design down here, and I'm kind of keeping that looseness and that flowiness that I have when I'm drawing hair and that we want to have when we're drawing hair. Let me just draw that ellipse more at a normal angle. And I'll plan out the basic shape of the clothing, and then I will insert the pipe folds by creating my waves as we go. I can even add one here on the outside with an overlap, and then bring in these lines up. And it's all about the overlap here again, just like it is in here, and therefore achieving our pipe fold look in this type of cloth. Thinner types of cloth tend to pipe fold more easily. Well, I say thinner, but also heavier, because they'll want to tend to pipe fold. But generally, you're looking at a longer cloth that tends to pipe fold as gravity is pulling down and the fabric gets heavier. So this essentially are our pipe folds here. Right. And you will see this commonly on long pieces of fabric, curtains, long dresses, and generally materials that are quite long. All right, so those are our pipe folds. Let's move on to zigzag folds. So zigzag folds are named the way they are because the fold kind of works in a zigzag pattern, very much like this. Now, where you would use these types of folds, and you'll see as we get into some demos here, is generally at the ends of sleeves, long sleeves, as they come down to the wrist area. You may also want to use them where fabric's compressing, like pants compressing down against shoes, for example. And anywhere you feel that the fabric would be compressing in such a way as to create this effect, right? It's sort of a medium amount of compression would cause a zigzag effect. So what happens is you start having the folds kind of poking out like this, and note how they don't mirror each other, right? So we're not doing zigzag folds like this, where they're kind of sawtoothing, mirroring each other. And we will then want to kind of connect the fabric in a way that we're showing overlapping lines as the fabric is compressing. So this is a zigzag type of fold because maybe the fabric is compressing down here. Also the knees, sometimes the knees on certain pants will compress. So let's do some examples to show an example of this. Let's say I'm drawing a sports jacket. This would be the wrist section. And the players pulled the sleeves just past the wrist, sort of to the middle of the forearm, for example. So I want to show the compression of that fabric occurring. And so I'm going to come in here and I'm going to zigzag the sleeves a little bit. And what I can do is I can use this shape, which you'll see is a common fold shape, and of course you can make derivatives of it, to show indentations in the fabric. So here we will pull these overlaps in our zigzag folds. Okay, he's pulled it just a little bit up, it's compressing a little bit. We want to bear in mind that we are on a cylindrical form with the arm, so we want to have the contour line showing very clearly. Okay, and then anywhere where we feel the fabric may indent, we can input one of these little shapes, right, where it's kind of a shadow, and you can really just vary them and do whatever you like with them. Usually it's drawn where the shape doesn't just simply close, but it overlaps one of its own lines there, right? And this helps us indicate areas where there are deeper folds happening in the fabric, or creases or crinkles to varying degrees. Okay, and so I can just put in a couple of these. The key thing to remember with fabric is it's not an exact science. You know, cloth really does whatever it wants to do. So you can't really sit there and control every micro element of how you want the fabric to look. Rather strive for a natural look, and by natural I mean pretty kind of almost random, keeping things asymmetrical. So here we can see in the sleeve section here, we've got that zigzag effect kind of happening, right? Let's do another example where we may be doing a pants leg. It's coming down from the knee, and maybe it's bunching in the knee a little bit, right? So we can start off with a zigzag design there, imagining the leg anatomy underneath there. And it comes down, and as we get to the shoe, we can start putting in some of these zigzag shapes for the compression as the pants compress on top of a shoe. Let's just make this a little bit smaller. Okay, this person's leg is at a bit of a strange angle. Let's just keep it at more of a straight angle. And this would be the front of their shoe down here. Just kind of roughing that in. And so the pants are compressing, they're wrapping around, and we have the zigzag pattern showing the compression happening. So once again, we're emphasizing our overlaps. We're making sure we've got a zigzag type of look in there. And usually the pants, depends how baggy the pants are, we could have some really nice deep little shadows occurring as the pants get this zigzag effect happening in them. Right, and once again we have the zigzag fold. So this is a type of fold that occurs once again on sort of pants, jeans, areas where we've kind of got medium compression, right, where there is a medium amount of compression happening. And I would contrast that with the spiral folds, which we'll look at next, where you have a lot of compression happening on the fabric, and so the fabric takes on a little bit more of a spiral look, as we will see. Right, so this is our zigzag type of fold. And really, to get good at drawing this stuff is really just drawing it and just remembering these rules. Asymmetry, and of course these rules here are quite key to just implementing these basic fold types. Also, you would do well to really just memorize these 7 fold types and use them where you need to. You don't need to make clothing, drawing clothing overly complicated for yourself. Just memorize them, remember the basic rules, be loose, and off you go. Okay, the next type of fold we're going to be looking at are spiral folds. Now, spiral folds kind of move in this type of way. Whoops, let's just draw that a different knee. They're kind of constantly spiraling in this sort of pattern. And this is due to heavy compression. And this is when someone pulls up their sleeves, for example. That's the most common area you see it, or wherever the fabric is being compressed on a cylindrical form quite a lot. So if there was a sleeve on here and we pushed the sleeve all the way up, we compressed it to half of its total length, we'd get spiral folds happening. Kind of looks a bit like a spring or one of those vacuum cleaner hoses. So let's do an example of that. And with the spiral folds, we tend to use a lot of these shading shapes on the fabric, right? You'll see here. So let's do a sleeve again. And of course, you know, I'm doing very basic clothing here, but this could equally apply to perhaps stockings being pushed down or socks compressing. Socks compressing is an excellent example of spiral folds. When the socks have fallen down or compressed down. So really, you want to apply these theories to a bunch of different things, right? So here I'm going to kind of plan out the folds. I'm trying to keep them more asymmetrical. I don't want them to kind of be too the same on each side. And I also want to leave room to have some actual clothing lines in there, so it doesn't look so robotic, as if it was designed to be in this spirally kind of way. And maybe as it moves up to the shoulder, let's just say the cloth moves up to the shoulder here, we put some overlaps in to show the cloth overlapping over itself. Maybe the spiral folds will kind of come to an end, right? So we're really compressing the fabric here, and we're contouring the lines. Right, so now I'm going to just draw in a much clearer silhouette to these spiral folds, keeping my overlaps nice and clear. Draw this fold in there, this one there. Keep striving for asymmetry as well. And we'll draw one there. All right, and because we're having this compression, we want those shadows in, right? The little shadow indicators. It just really helps sell the idea of how much compression is happening on these types of folds. And once again, be loose, be natural, especially be natural. You know, clothing, as I said, does its own thing. So don't try to control it. Just compress it as you think it needs to be compressed. Consider the material type, right? And work from there. Thicker materials, of course, may not compress as easily as thinner materials and so on. So you might have more neat looking compressions or more rough looking compressions based on what's happening with the fabric. All right, and so here we see our spiral fold, typical marks of a spiral fold. A lot of compression and a lot of these little bumped edges occurring as we move through the spiral as it rotates, and of course a lot of these shadow shapes in here as well. So those are our spiral folds. All right. I do hope you're taking notes as we go through this. It would be very useful for you. Let's take a look at half-lock folds now. So when it comes to half-lock folds, particularly, I'm not entirely sure why they're called half-lock folds. I've never really investigated it. But the idea we want to have with half-lock folds is that on one side we're having compression occurring on a form, and I'm drawing an arm here that is bending at a 90-degree angle. This is more of just the model of what's happening with the folds. So we have a compression happening on one side, and then on the other we have a stretching happening. And because of this, we get a lot of tight folds occurring at the point of tension here, where the fabric is pulling in at this point over here, causing these fold lines to appear that we see on the inside here by our point of compression. Okay, I'm just putting in the words here, expansion, so we're really getting it. And our tension would be here. All right. And so areas you see half-lock folds are generally points of articulation, right? Points of articulation where our limbs can move, the actual joint areas where they move is where we will see these types of folds occurring. All right. At the points of articulation. So, for example, I'll do a sleeve example. If we have a man wearing a collared shirt, for example, and he's bending his arm a little bit, draw the arm section here. Maybe there's a button there or something. And he's bending his arm. It's going to emphasize some of these overlaps here. And the fabric starts wrapping over itself and being pulled as his arm bends, right? And we get these half-lock folds, characterized really by the overlapping and the directionality toward the point of tension. All right, so that's really what we would do there. And you would do this in the same area on the legs, obviously the back of the legs. And also areas where the fabric is very tight. And actually that brings me to a point that I want to talk to you about. I'm going to do a small diagram here. When people draw jeans and pants, particularly at the crotch area, a lot of the time the fold lines here are drawn up like this, right, at the crotch. And then the pants sort of carry on very tightly down. And this is actually not correct. It looks bad, but it's also not correct. To overemphasize the crotch for one thing, which can look super weird at times. But that's not actually what happens with the fabric, because underneath here we have the really cylindrical like legs, right? And so when you contemplate the actual forms underneath, the correct way to have these pants lines drawn, and I'm going to just do a quick example here. So here we'd have our legs coming down, and here's our crotch. And certainly we can have a line or two showing the crotch, of course, that we're going to have those overlaps there to show what is in front, what is behind. But in terms of the point of tension here, the point of tension is not actually just spamming out all these fold lines from the crotch. With pants, they tend to come out at a horizontal angle here, right? Horizontal, instead of this V shape. So we get this V shape, that's incorrect. We want them to come out horizontally at those points of tension on the rounded forms, right? And this would be more correct. All right, so those are our half-lock folds. There are overlaps on one side of a compressed cloth section that is overform, and because the other side is really experiencing stretching or expansion. All right, half-lock folds. And I've said this twice already, I apologize for saying it again. Looseness, guys. You've got to be loose and you've got to be natural. You can't control exactly what it's going to look like. I know it may seem like I'm having, extreme or supreme control over what I'm drawing here, but really I'm kind of guesstimating and letting the lines kind of go where they want to go so that it looks natural, because I'm drawing it in a way that is natural. Okay, so let's keep that in mind. Looseness, looseness, looseness. I'll try not to say it again. All right, let's move on. The next type of fold, a very easy kind of fold, diaper folds. Poor fold name there. All right, so with diaper folds, when a piece of fabric is suspended at 2 points, this is usually when it happens. And I can show you actually some cool examples where you might do this type of fold. Let's assume this is a square piece of fabric, right? So gravity's pulling down, and we're very aware of it, and we're thinking about gravity, right, pulling down on that. The 2 points of tension here cause the fabric, of course, to stretch a little bit there, which we can indicate with some lines. And then as it comes down into the middle, it causes a C curve to occur. So I'm going to draw in some of these C curves, and there you have a diaper fold, a very realistic looking fold in the cloth, right? Because the center of gravity comes down here, the biggest weight, right? Center of gravity comes down here, and so we get this C-shaped curve happening in the middle of the cloth. Right, and while we're on this, before I do a demo of this, let me say that folds, clothing, drawing cloth is very similar to drawing hair. So don't be afraid to just draw a particular shape. For example, I'll just draw this square shape here, and then erase a corner, for example, and take it and just do a random overlap. And boom, we've just controlled the cloth's overlap, right? So now suddenly looks like we've got a piece of cloth wrapping there, and we can do the same here as well. We're just going to draw a shape like that, and now we're controlling the cloth. Okay, so it's not very hard, and you can keep the shapes really abstract looking. You don't need to control them. All right, so it's not exactly going to be the most amazing example of a diaper fold, but for example, you may be drawing a tabard, which is a piece of cloth that goes over the front of a knight's armor, representing his guild house or what have you, right? So the tabard would usually be, it would be kind of designed something like this. If we were looking at it from a top view and we laid it on a table, place for the head, this area wraps around the back, this area wraps around the front. Usually there's some kind of logo design on the front of it, and it just hangs down. All right. So if we're doing a tabard, for example, because we've got the 2 points of tension on our knight's shoulders, we would have the fabric hanging down something like that. Actually, we would combine, it depends how long this is, but we could have some pipe folds at the bottom, but over here at the top, we'd have some so-called diaper folds occurring, right, as the tabard hangs over the knight. Right. Otherwise, the cloth just really is characterized by this C shape. So there we have our diaper folds. Suppose if you're not in the United States, that would be a nappy fold, which makes it sound like 10 times worse. Okay. Anyway, let's move on. We're going to do drop folds. It's probably the easier form of diaper folds, drop folds. And with drop folds, we have a single point of tension. Kind of imagine if you were hanging your towel on the hook, or on a hook in the bathroom. And so our cloth kind of comes down, and this ton of bunches at the bottom. It may even pipe fold at the bottom. And what we have is the drop folds coming down here, these tension lines showing that there's a lot of tension at this point of tension here, this hook area where the cloth is draped from. Now you could use this for all sorts of different things. You know, perhaps this is a character and it's a, you know, some kind of embroidery in her hair, some kind of cloth in her hair hanging down, for example. But what characterizes it is that we have these lines here coming down from the point of tension, and then the cloth hanging down and overlapping itself, right? So these are drop folds. Let's do a cloth, for example, a towel, for example. Just pretend we've got a towel hanging over a hook. I'll draw this one a little bit more detailed. But really, all of the skill in drawing clothing is just very much weighted towards, are you just contemplating your overlaps properly, right? So the hook is under there. We'll put a little shadow line there, that little shadow shape, to show that our kind of towel is holding there. We'll have some lines here. Just put some shading in there. We don't need to worry too much about shading. And have it coming down, and we'll overlap another piece here of towel. Have that coming up, and maybe it wraps in a bit, comes around, have that going there, and, you know, bada bing, bada boom, we've got our towel on a hook in the bathroom pretty much nailed down. All right. So that really is our drop fold. Okay. Awesome. And last but not least, we're going to take a look at our inert folds. Now, just keep in mind that inert is referring to inactive. The word inert means inactive. So they're folds that are kind of just there because of probably some energy that occurred at some point on the fold. The typical way that this is illustrated, the typical example is a cloth covering a ball. So here is where we would use those shading shapes quite a bit to really emphasize those folds, but of course we're also relying on overlaps. So for example, here I will kind of imagine a ball underneath a piece of cloth. I'll draw it at an angle, and the cloth's kind of rolling about. Let's make it a kind of a square piece of cloth, and it overlaps itself at some points. Maybe it builds up, trying to keep these sharp points so that we still feel like it's a square piece of cloth. And I'm just creating some overlaps there. And our ball's under here, so we would kind of have drop fold like lines as the fabric kind of fights its way down over the ball. But then we have these other folds that kind of happen where the cloth bunches up on itself. And we can then add some of these shaded zones just to emphasize the sort of scrunching of the fabric. And these types of folds would be called the inert folds, because they're not really the result of any kind of tension or gravity on them at present. They just kind of happened at one point, and so they just continue to just stay there. They maintain their form, right? And these are inert folds. All right. So that is that for cloth dynamics and drawing cloth. And if you follow these basic rules and you do a bunch of practice, you will be pretty good at this pretty quickly, I think. This isn't really one of the most complex areas of drawing, to be honest with you. Something I would advise you do is really gear your eyes up to observing the world around you much more than usual. We have to kind of escape the world of the muggles, so to speak, and really get into a zone where as artists we're observing everything around us, you know, really close up. We're zooming in on everything, we're focusing on everything. Why is this shape, or what is the shape of this when it's in this position or that position? And clothing, learning to draw clothing well is going to rely a lot on how well you can see and how well you're observing the clothing around you and how it moves and how it works. But these 7 folds are a very, very strong foundation for you to get drawing clothing pretty quickly. All right, that is the end of this module. I'll see you guys in the next module.